Welcome to this journey through one of the most profoundly unsettling winters ever experienced in the Ozark Highlands. In the years when survival depended on hearing approaching danger, when the crack of breaking ice, or the sound of distant axes, or the call of a neighbor across the valley were essential communications that connected isolated homesteads, there came a season when sound itself began to fail. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the silence that descended on a valley and refused to lift. This video is a work of fiction, created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we enter the silence, consider what sound meant to frontier settlers, particularly during winter, when visibility was often limited by weather and by the early darkness that characterized the season. Sound was information. The crack of a tree branch under snow load told you whether accumulation was becoming dangerous. The bark of your dog alerted you to approaching animals or people. The ring of an axe from a neighbor's property assured you that others were alive and working, that you were not alone in the landscape even when you could not see them. Sound was also safety. The absence of normal sounds, birds falling silent, animals ceasing their movements, warned of predators or approaching storms. The presence of wrong sounds, ice groaning on a creek that should be solid, wind patterns that suggested changing weather, allowed you to prepare for dangers before they arrived. To lose sound was to lose a critical sense that frontier life demanded you maintain. And sound was connection. In a region where homesteads might be separated by miles and where winter weather often prevented travel, the ability to hear a neighbor's bell or voice or axe created community across distance. You knew you were not alone because you could hear evidence of others' existence. Silence, in that context, was isolation made absolute. The year 1847 marked a period of established settlement in a valley along the upper reaches of the White River drainage, in highlands that would eventually be divided among several Arkansas counties, but that were then simply known by the creek that ran through them, Cobb's Creek, named for an early settler. 8 families lived in the valley, occupying homesteads scattered along approximately 4 miles of creek bottom and lower slopes. They had been there for varying lengths of time, from the Cobb family who had arrived in the late 1830s to the Pattersons who had settled just the previous spring, and they had developed the kind of cooperative community that frontier survival required while maintaining the independence that had drawn them to the region in the first place. The valley was well suited for settlement. The creek provided reliable water year-round. The bottomland soil was reasonably fertile for the region. The surrounding ridges were heavily forested, providing ample timber and game. The terrain was steep enough to create good drainage, but not so precipitous as to prevent farming or travel. It was, by Ozark standards, a favorable location. Not easy, but workable, offering reasonable prospects for families willing to invest the labor required to establish productive homesteads. Winter came early in 1847, with the first substantial snow falling in mid-November, rather than the more typical early December. The families were prepared. Food stores were adequate, firewood had been gathered and stacked, repairs to buildings and equipment had been completed. The early onset was noted, but not particularly concerning. Winter would last however long it lasted, and an early start simply meant planning for a potentially extended season. The first indication that this winter would be different from others came in late November, approximately 2 weeks after the initial snowfall. Samuel Cobb, the patriarch of the founding family, noticed while working in his barn that he could not hear his axe striking wood as clearly as he should have. The sound was present, but muted, as if he were hearing it through a thick cloth or from a greater distance than the few feet that separated him from his work. He tested this observation by striking the barn wall with his axe, listening for the sharp crack that should result. The sound came, but it was dull, attenuated, wrong. Samuel mentioned this to his wife, Rebecca, that evening, asking if she had noticed anything unusual about sounds in or around the house. She confirmed that she had. The fire in the hearth seemed quieter than usual, crackling less audibly. The wind outside, which should have been easily heard through the cabin's inevitable gaps and drafts, was barely perceptible as sound even when she could feel the cold air it brought. They discussed possible explanations. Perhaps the snow cover was dampening sounds, absorbing them before they could propagate normally. Perhaps the cold air was affecting how sound traveled. Samuel had some vague notion that temperature might influence sound, though he did not understand the mechanisms well enough to predict specific effects. Perhaps their hearing was somehow affected, though both felt fine otherwise and could converse normally when close together. The following day, Samuel visited his nearest neighbor, Daniel Morrison, to inquire whether he had noticed anything unusual. Daniel confirmed that he had. Sounds seemed muted, less distinct than they should be, as if the valley itself had become padded with some invisible material that absorbed noise. The two men conducted a test, positioning themselves at opposite ends of Daniel's cleared field, perhaps 100 yards apart, and attempting to call to each other. Under normal conditions, this distance would allow easy communication, but they found that they had to shout to be heard at all, and even then the words were indistinct, the volume far less than the effort should have produced. Over the following week, the sound dampening became more pronounced. Activities that should have been audible from substantial distances, chopping wood, calling livestock, ringing the bell that one family used to signal mealtimes, were barely perceptible beyond a few dozen yards. The ambient sounds of the valley diminished as well. The creek, which normally produced a constant background murmur as water moved over rocks, became silent, or nearly so. Wind through the trees, which should have been prominent given the winter storms that were passing through the region, was reduced to barely detectable whispers. By mid-December, approximately 1 month after the first snowfall, and 3 weeks after the initial observations of sound dampening, the situation had progressed to the point that normal acoustic functioning had ceased within the valley. Sounds still occurred, axes still struck wood, doors still closed, people still spoke, but the sounds were drastically reduced in volume and in the distance they could travel. A gunshot fired into the air, which under normal conditions should have echoed through the valley and been heard by all the families, was reported as being barely audible to someone standing 100 feet away from the shooter. The community gathered at the Cobb homestead in late December to discuss the phenomenon and to determine what, if anything, should be done about it. On Monday, the meeting itself demonstrated the problem. With 8 families present, representing perhaps 35 people total in the largest structure available, conversation was difficult. People had to position themselves very close to speak and be heard, and anyone more than a few feet away from a speaker could barely distinguish words from general noise. Several theories were proposed to explain what was happening. The most scientifically minded member of the community, a man named Joseph Harper, who had some formal education, suggested that the cold and snow were creating atmospheric conditions that prevented normal sound propagation. Perhaps the air was too dense, or too dry, or too cold for sound waves to travel as they normally did. This explanation had the virtue of being naturalistic, requiring no supernatural or inexplicable causes, but it did not account for why this particular winter was different from others they had experienced, some of which had been equally cold and snowy. Others suggested that the valley's geography might be responsible. that something about the specific configuration of ridges and hollows was creating acoustic effects that happened only under particular weather conditions. But the valley had not changed, and winter weather had occurred many times before without producing similar effects. If geography were responsible, the phenomenon should have been observed in previous years. A few people, generally the older residents or those with more traditional folk beliefs, proposed that the silence was a sign or warning, that the valley was being affected by forces beyond human understanding, that they should interpret the loss of sound as an indication that they should leave or at least prepare for some approaching danger. This interpretation was not widely accepted. Most of the settlers were practical people who preferred natural explanations and who were reluctant to abandon established homesteads based on phenomena that, while strange, had not yet caused direct harm. The decision reached at the meeting was to continue observing, to maintain careful records of how the sound dampening progressed, and to send a representative to the nearest settlement outside the valley, approximately 2 days' travel in good weather, to inquire whether similar effects were being experienced elsewhere, or whether anyone had knowledge that might explain what was occurring in Cobb's Creek Valley. The representative, a young man named Thomas Patterson, who had volunteered for the journey, departed in early January when weather permitted travel. He returned 5 days later and reported that sound outside the valley was completely normal. As soon as he had crossed the ridge that defined the valley's eastern boundary, acoustic functioning had returned to expected levels. In the settlement he visited, no one had heard of anything similar occurring, and several people suggested that he must have been mistaken or exaggerating what was probably just normal winter sound dampening from snow cover. But Thomas had tested carefully during his journey. Upon returning to the valley, he had noticed the exact point at which sound began to diminish. Not gradually along a slope, but sharply at a specific location on the ridge trail, as if he were crossing a boundary between normal space and a region where different acoustic rules applied. He had experimented by moving back and forth across this boundary, confirming that he could reproduce the transition from normal to dampened sound simply by changing his position relative to the valley. This discovery was both informative and disturbing. It meant that whatever was causing the sound dampening was localized to the valley specifically, that it was not a regional weather phenomenon or a general effect of winter conditions. It suggested that the valley itself was somehow different, that something about the space contained within its ridges was preventing sound from behaving normally. Through January and into February, the sound dampening continued to intensify. Conversations required speaking directly into someone's ear to be understood. Livestock made no audible sounds, even when obviously distressed or calling to each other. Doors could be slammed without producing more than a dull thud. Guns fired, axes struck, and metal rang against metal, all with sounds so muted that they seemed to come from great distances, even when occurring just feet away. What was most disturbing was the psychological effect of the progressive silence. Humans rely on sound for spatial awareness, for monitoring their environment, for maintaining connection with others, even when not in visual contact. The absence of normal acoustic feedback created profound disorientation. People became uncertain of distances, of whether actions they performed had the effects they should, of whether dangers might be approaching unheard. Children were particularly affected. They had learned to regulate their behavior partly through sound, understanding that loud activities brought parental attention, that quiet was sometimes required, that the level of noise they made had social consequences. In an environment where all sounds were equally muted, these regulatory mechanisms failed. Children shouted to be heard and received no acoustic confirmation that they were being loud. They played games that normally involved noise and found the games eerily silent. Several children became anxious or withdrawn, disturbed by the wrongness of a world where sound did not function as it should. Adults adapted by developing non-acoustic communication strategies. They established visual signals for common communications, used touch more frequently to get attention, and learned to watch each other's lips and facial expressions to supplement the limited sound they could hear. But these adaptations were exhausting and incomplete, and the constant strain of communicating without reliable sound created social tension and individual stress that accumulated across the long winter months. More serious were the safety implications of the silence. Animals that normally gave warning of their presence through sound could now approach unheard. Falling trees made no warning crack before they toppled. Ice breaking on the creek was inaudible until someone actually saw the water rising. The loss of auditory warning systems meant that the valley's residents had to maintain constant visual vigilance, a level of alertness that was impossible to sustain continuously, and that left them vulnerable during the times when attention inevitably lapsed. In late February, an incident occurred that demonstrated the danger clearly. A young child, 3-year-old Sarah Morrison, wandered away from her family's cabin while her mother was occupied with indoor work. Under normal conditions, the mother would have heard the child's movements, her voice if she called out, and would have been alerted to her absence within minutes. But in the silence of the valley, the child walked away unheard, and her absence was not noticed until the mother looked for her more than an hour later. The search for Sarah mobilized all the families in the valley. They spread out across the snow-covered landscape, calling her name, firing guns to attract attention, ringing bells, all with the knowledge that even if Sarah were nearby, she might not hear them, and they might not hear her if she called back. The search continued through the afternoon and into the evening, with lanterns and torches eventually being brought out as darkness fell. Sarah was found after nightfall, approximately a quarter-mile from her home, sitting in the snow beside a fallen log. She was cold and frightened, but otherwise unharmed. She told her rescuers that she had been calling for her mother, that she had heard her mother and others calling back, but that the sounds had all been very quiet, like whispers, and she had not been able to determine which direction they came from. She had tried to walk toward the voices, but had become lost, and had eventually sat down to wait. The child's survival was fortunate, and her story about hearing quiet voices was disturbing in its confirmation that the sound dampening affected everyone equally. Even a child's naturally sharper hearing could not overcome whatever was preventing sound from propagating normally through the valley. If sound could not be relied upon for locating lost children, for warning of dangers, for coordinating work or responding to emergencies, then the valley had become fundamentally more dangerous than it had been before the silence descended. By early March, the community faced a decision. The silence showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying, with sounds becoming progressively more muted week by week. Spring was approaching, which would normally bring relief from winter's hardships, but the silence was a year-round concern if it persisted. The valley was becoming uninhabitable, not because of cold or snow, but because of the loss of a critical sense that safety and sanity both required. A meeting was called to discuss whether the families should abandon their homesteads and relocate to areas where sound functioned normally. This was a grave decision. Leaving meant abandoning years of investment in land clearing, building construction, and all the accumulated infrastructure that made frontier farming viable. It meant starting over elsewhere, finding new land, rebuilding from nothing. It meant admitting defeat by a phenomenon no one understood and could not fight. The discussion revealed deep divisions. Younger families with fewer years invested in the valley were more willing to consider leaving. They argued that no amount of prior investment justified remaining in a place that was becoming actively dangerous, that the inability to hear was too great a handicap to accept, that they should leave before something worse happened than a child getting lost. Older residents, particularly those like the Cobbs who had been first to settle the valley and who had the most to lose from abandonment, argued for patience. The silence had begun with winter, they noted, and perhaps it would end with winter's conclusion. Spring might restore normal acoustic functioning, just as it restored warmth and growth. Leaving in March just before spring might mean abandoning homesteads unnecessarily just days or weeks before the problem resolved itself. Joseph Harper, attempting to mediate, proposed a compromise. They would wait until the spring equinox, approximately 3 weeks away. If the silence persisted beyond that point, beyond the clear transition from winter to spring, they would accept that it was not seasonally limited and would begin organized departure. But if sound returned with spring, they would remain and would simply note the winter of 1847 as an anomalous but concluded phenomenon. This compromise was accepted, and the families returned to their homesteads to wait for the equinox and to see whether spring would bring acoustic restoration along with its other gifts. The 3-week waiting period was characterized by heightened attention to any changes in sound levels, by daily tests of how far voices or other noises could be heard, by desperate hope that each day might show improvement. But no improvement came. March progressed. The snow began to melt. The first signs of spring growth appeared, but the silence persisted. Sounds remained muted. Distances remained inaudible. The valley continued to absorb and diminish every noise made within its boundaries. The equinox arrived with the silence unbroken, and the community had to face the reality that the phenomenon was not seasonally limited, that spring would not automatically restore what winter had taken. The organized departure began in early April. Families packed what possessions they could carry, or load into wagons, prepared their livestock for travel, and made arrangements to move to regions where relatives or friends could provide temporary assistance while they searched for new land to claim. The departure was orderly but sorrowful. No one wanted to leave. Everyone felt the loss of the investment and effort they were abandoning. But the consensus was that remaining in a silent valley was not viable long-term. The first families to leave were the Pattersons and the Morrisons, who departed on April 8th with wagons loaded with essential possessions and with their livestock driven ahead. They were followed 2 days later by the Harpers and the Sawyers. By mid-April, 6 of the 8 families had departed, leaving only the Cobbs and one other family, the Mitchells, who had decided to wait through the summer to see whether the silence would eventually break. Samuel Cobb, whose name the creek bore and who had invested more than a decade in establishing his homestead, was unable to bring himself to leave without being absolutely certain that departure was necessary. He and Daniel Mitchell, the only other family head who shared this reluctance, agreed to maintain their properties through the growing season, to plant crops and tend livestock as if normal life could continue, and to reassess in the fall whether remaining was truly impossible. The summer of 1847 passed in near total silence. The Cobbs and the Mitchells worked their fields, maintained their buildings, lived their lives as best they could in a valley that had lost its voice. They saw each other regularly, visiting across the mile that separated their homesteads, communicating through the combinations of close speech, written notes, and gestures that they had developed during the winter. What they noticed during the summer was that the silence was not uniform across all types of sound. Natural sounds, birds, insects, wind, water, were almost completely absent, reduced to levels so low as to be effectively inaudible. But sounds created by human action, while still drastically muted, were slightly more audible than natural sounds. A voice speaking loudly could be heard at perhaps 20 feet, while birdsong could not be heard even when birds were visibly present and obviously calling. This distinction suggested that the silence was not simply acoustic dampening, but was in some sense selective, affecting natural sounds more severely than human-created ones. Why this should be, what it meant, what was doing the selecting, these questions could not be answered. But the observation hinted that the phenomenon was not merely physical, but involved some kind of discrimination between sound types or sources. By late September, with harvest approaching and with the realization that another winter in the valley would mean another season of silence and isolation, Samuel Cobb and Daniel Mitchell made the decision to join the families who had left earlier. They could not sustain viable homesteads in permanent silence, could not raise children in an environment where a critical sense was non-functional, could not continue to invest labor and hope in a place that had become fundamentally hostile to human habitation, in ways that went beyond mere physical hardship. They departed in early October, Samuel taking a final walk through the valley he had named, looking at the clearings he had created, the buildings he had raised, the improvements he had made across years of work. All of it would be abandoned to the forest, would deteriorate and disappear, would eventually leave no trace that families had lived here and built lives here before the silence drove them away. Before leaving, Samuel carved a warning on a prominent tree near the trail that led into the valley. "Sound fails here. Do not settle." It was the only monument he could leave, the only way he could think to warn potential future settlers about the valley's peculiarity. The valley stood empty through the winter of 1847, 1848, and through the following years. Occasional travelers passed through, following the creek valley as a natural route through the highlands. Some noticed the unusual silence, the way sounds seemed to die away more quickly than they should. Others passed through without particular notice, attributing any acoustic strangeness to the dense forest or to the valley's steep walls. Samuel Cobb's carved warning remained visible for several years, though weather and growth gradually obscured it. A few people who saw it apparently heeded its message, as no new settlement attempts were made in the valley during the late 1840s or early 1850s. But memories are short, warnings are forgotten, and the valley eventually lost its reputation as a place to avoid. In 1856, a family named the Crawfords settled in the valley, unaware of its history or of the warning that had been carved 9 years earlier, and that had since become illegible. They built a cabin, cleared fields, and began to establish a homestead. They experienced a normal first summer and fall, and when winter came, they initially noticed nothing unusual. But in mid-January of 1857, approximately the same point in winter when the original settlers had first observed a sound dampening in 1847, the Crawfords began to notice that sounds were becoming muted. The progression was identical to what the earlier settlers had experienced: gradual intensification of silence, selective dampening that affected natural sounds more than human-created ones, complete acoustic dysfunction by late winter. The Crawfords, having no knowledge of the previous occurrence, went through the same process of confusion, testing, and eventual realization that the valley itself was somehow preventing normal sound propagation. They departed in the spring of 1857, leaving behind another abandoned homestead and carrying with them a story about a valley where sound died during winter. This second occurrence established a pattern. The valley's acoustic anomaly was apparently not a one-time event, but a recurring phenomenon, something that happened every winter, or at least happened frequently enough that settlement attempts during the 1850s and 1860s all eventually failed, due to the silence that descended each cold season. By the 1870s, the valley had acquired a local reputation as being strange or wrong, in ways that people who knew the region could not quite articulate, but that were sufficient to discourage new settlement attempts. The valley remained empty, its abandoned clearings growing over, its former home sites visible only as subtle depressions and unusually flat areas in otherwise irregular terrain. Modern investigation of the valley, and there has been some, as the story attracted attention from folklorists and acoustic researchers in the 20th century, has revealed no obvious physical explanation for the reported phenomena. The valley's shape and dimensions do not suggest unusual acoustic properties. The geology is typical for the region, with no identified features that would affect sound propagation. Measurements taken during winter months show normal acoustic functioning, with sounds traveling the expected distances and frequencies being transmitted without unusual attenuation. This absence of confirmation has led most researchers to conclude that the historical accounts were exaggerated or misremembered, that what the settlers experienced was probably normal winter sound, dampening from snow cover, combined with psychological factors related to isolation and the stress of frontier life. The progressive worsening of the silence, the selective dampening of different sound types, the boundary effect at the ridge, all of these are attributed to elaboration in retelling, to the human tendency to make stories more dramatic and mysterious than the actual events warranted. But the documentary evidence from the period is more detailed and consistent than is typical for exaggerated folklore. Multiple independent accounts from the 1847 settlement describe the same progression of silence, the same acoustic tests, the same failures of sound to propagate normally. The 1857 Crawford's account, written with no apparent knowledge of the earlier settlement's experience, describes phenomena that match those from a decade earlier. The pattern of multiple abandonment attempts across 2 decades suggests that something genuine was occurring, something that made the valley difficult enough to inhabit that families repeatedly chose to leave rather than adapt. Perhaps most intriguing are occasional modern reports from hikers or hunters who spend time in the valley during winter months. These reports are rare and generally dismissed as subjective impressions rather than objective observations, but they describe experiences that echo the historical accounts. Sounds seeming muted, voices not carrying as far as they should, an overall sense that the acoustic environment is somehow wrong. No systematic modern study has been conducted during winter months with equipment sensitive enough to detect subtle acoustic anomalies or with sufficient duration to observe whether phenomena might develop progressively over weeks or months, as the historical accounts suggest they did. The valley is remote enough, and the reports are ambiguous enough that funding such a study has not been deemed worthwhile by institutions that might have the resources to conduct it. The valley exists, unnamed on most maps, identified on some as Cobb Creek Valley, in reference to the early settler whose carved warning once stood as testament to the winter when sound failed. It remains largely empty, with no permanent residents and with only occasional temporary use by hunters or by people seeking isolated locations for recreation. Whether the silence still descends during winter, whether the acoustic anomalies that drove out 3 separate settlement attempts in the 19th century still occur, remains unknown. What is known is that sound is fragile, that our reliance on hearing is so fundamental that we rarely consider it until it fails, and that a world without sound is a world profoundly different from the one we navigate normally. The settlers of 1847 encountered this difference, lived with it for months, tried to adapt to it, and ultimately could not. The silence defeated them not through violence or through obvious danger, but through the simple relentless fact of its presence, through the wrongness of a valley that absorbed sound and refused to return it, through the psychological toll of living in a landscape that had lost its voice. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark's most quietly disturbing mysteries, a valley where winter brought not just cold and snow, but progressive silence, where sound itself failed across months of increasing acoustic dysfunction, where families were driven from their homes not by danger. They could hear but by the absence of hearing itself. The winter the valley stopped making sound stands as a reminder that the senses we rely on are less stable than we assume, that the properties of the world that seem most fundamental can prove most fragile, and that silence, which we often seek as respite from noise, becomes horror when it is complete and involuntary, and when it strips away a critical dimension of how we understand and navigate the world around us. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where sound died and silence ruled, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between the natural and the impossible, between ordinary hardship and phenomena that defy explanation. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what it would mean to lose hearing, not through personal impairment but through environmental failure, on how you would adapt to a world where sound could not be trusted. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you notice the sounds around you and consider what their absence would mean, a like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate mysteries that arise when fundamental properties of reality prove less reliable than we need them to be. Until our next journey into territories where the familiar becomes impossible and the expected cannot be trusted, drive safely, and remember that every sound you hear is a gift that might be revoked, that silence can be imposed as well as chosen, and that some valleys in the Ozarks might still fall quiet each winter, absorbing sound and refusing to return it, waiting patient and voiceless for travelers who might not hear the warnings that predecessors carved into trees whose bark has long since grown over the words that said simply, "Sound fails here. Do not settle